Hello, I am a grandmother, nearly 60 years old. I decided to share my story because of my daughter-in-law, Emily, and my son, David. My husband, Stephen, and I faced many difficulties in the early years of our marriage. We couldn't have children right away, which brought us great anxiety and sadness. After many years of trying, we finally gave birth to David, and we raised him as our most precious treasure. However, looking back, I realized that we overprotected him out of fear that something might happen to him. We never left him alone and even avoided showing excessive affection, fearing it would make him weak. Now I see that this overprotection was probably a mistake, shaping his life and ours in unexpected ways. Years passed, and David grew up. At the age of 30, he got married. My husband, who retired as a civil servant, receives a stable pension, which allows us to live without worrying too much about finances, enjoying a peaceful daily life in our home in Seattle. Even so, the news of David's wedding brought me mixed feelings of joy and anxiety. When he announced that he was engaged, I was overjoyed. I always dreamed of seeing my grandchildren running around in our home. Before the wedding, David brought Emily, his fiancée, to meet us more thoroughly. She was a very thin young woman with a pale face, indicating her fragile health. She looked exhausted but calm. I knew she had gone through hardships in her life and seemed very sensitive. With David, it was clear that he loved her, and that was enough for us. The first time we welcomed her to our home, I prepared a special dinner. However, Emily barely touched the food and explained that she had no appetite. Although this confused me a bit, I tried to understand. After all, this is no longer the old days when daughters-in-law were expected to strictly adhere to every tradition. Nowadays, it's more important that people feel comfortable, so I brushed aside any discomfort and simply wished them a happy and peaceful wedding. Initially, we didn't have much contact with David and Emily outside of family events. I thought that was enough, as they seemed to want their own space. But one day, I received an unexpected call. Emily was pregnant. I was overwhelmed with joy. The prospect of becoming a grandmother was something I had long awaited. When the baby was born, I visited them and brought a small envelope with $10,000 as a gift to help with initial expenses. We left shortly after, but I couldn't stop thinking about my grandson Paul's face. He was very beautiful, but I noticed he was very sensitive, which also worried me. I tried to minimize my presence to avoid causing any inconvenience. However, before we left, David followed me to the door and hesitantly asked me and Stephen to take care of the baby. It was hard to believe, as it had only been a few days since the baby was born. I explained to David that Paul still needed his mother, and separating him from her too early was not good. David insisted, saying that Emily was worried about losing everything she had built in her career. He noted that perhaps the baby came at an inconvenient time for her. Though it was hard to hear, I tried to understand their perspective. I told David we would discuss the situation but made no promises. When I returned home and shared this request with Stephen, he was firm. No, absolutely not. My husband, now retired, had worked his whole life and dreamed of traveling, enjoying peace in his retirement. We had given everything we could to our son. Now it was time for them to take responsibility. He argued strongly that we no longer had the strength to care for a child like that. I knew he was right, but David's plea haunted me. He kept calling, begging for help, and my mother's heart couldn't say no. Although Stephen insisted we should refuse, I agreed to take care of Paul for a while. In the end, the thought of having my grandson was too hard to resist. The baby with sparkling eyes was impossible to refuse. A few months later, David and Emily brought Paul to our home. From that moment, I took on the role of a caregiving grandmother. It wasn't easy at all. Paul cried a lot at night, and my sleep became rare. During the day, the work seemed never-ending, preparing bottles, caring for the baby. Stephen tried to help as much as he could, but our routine began to change completely. Still, I tried to focus on the positive. I was nurturing my grandson and could see him grow. However, the sleepless nights and constant worries about Paul began to take a toll. Stephen, who had always supported me, became impatient, and our arguments became more frequent. The tension grew day by day. The days with my grandson Paul became exhausting. The demands turned our home into a whirlwind of seemingly endless tasks. Fortunately, my husband Stephen was always a thoughtful partner and willing to help. But the arguments, which were rare before, now became more frequent. Paul's arrival brought not only joy, but also problems that began to shake our peace. The situation worsened when Emily started calling constantly. Her questions about Paul became increasingly intrusive. I tried to understand, thinking she was just worried like any young mother, but over time, her calls began to feel more like interrogations than genuine concern. Stephen, who always remained calm, started to get irritated with Emily's commanding tone and constant interference in our daily lives. One day, Emily came to our home with a proposal that left me utterly bewildered. "Mom," she said in a straightforward tone, "in a few days, a technician will install surveillance cameras in the master bedroom and living room." I was stunned, speechless. Stephen, who was listening, lost his patience. It was as if all the accumulated resentment finally exploded. "This is our home," he shouted, his voice echoing in the room. "You think you can do whatever you want here, installing cameras to monitor us? That's ridiculous." However, Emily didn't back down. She insisted that the cameras were necessary to monitor Paul to ensure he was well cared for. Stephen grew even angrier. "If you think we're not capable of taking care of your child, then take him home and care for him yourself," he declared, his voice full of resolve. It was the first time I saw him so emotional. Emily started crying, but her tears didn't calm Stephen's anger. David, who was there, tried to defuse the situation, but instead, he began criticizing us. "Why are you treating Emily like this?" he asked, his voice full of reproach. It was a heartbreaking moment for me. My son, whom I had raised with all my love and care, was now turning against us. After some effort to calm the tension, the situation finally settled, but Stephen was very clear in his stance. "This has to stop. We won't continue caring for Paul like this. It's too much for us." He was resolute, and for the first time, I began to wonder if we were doing the right thing. Emily had been sensitive from the start, but now, living with her daily, I realized it was more complicated than I thought. The coexistence began to create pressure in ways I never expected, and the feeling that something was deeply wrong wouldn't leave my mind. By the weekend, Emily often spent the entire day with us. Each time she came, it felt more like an inspection than a family visit. She looked around the house, pointing out any detail she didn't like. "There's dust piling up in the corners," she said once, as if it were a threat to Paul's health. "The air needs to be properly ventilated so the baby doesn't get sick." She even checked inside the bottles, suggesting they might not be properly cleaned, even though I was certain everything was sterilized. One day, while I was cleaning the kitchen, Emily found a strand of hair on the floor and began criticizing me. "What if Paul finds this and puts it in his mouth?" she exclaimed, as if it were the greatest tragedy. My patience had reached its limit. I took a deep breath and finally responded, "Emily, maybe I'm not clean or diligent enough to raise Paul. If so, you should raise him yourself." She was clearly shocked by my words, but continued, "If my parents had more money, things would be easier. I could stay home and take care of my child, but David and I have nothing. If I don't work, how will we buy our own house or ensure a good life for Paul? How will we provide for our child? Her eyes were full of frustration, and it seemed she wanted to place the responsibility on us. My siblings had houses bought for them by their parents, she said. David, who was there, remained silent, clearly uncomfortable. His face showed the shock and sadness of someone who knew things were spiraling out of control. These days, all young people are like this, I thought, trying to justify Emily's behavior. But deep down, it hurt me deeply. After David and Emily left, I cried in Stephen's arms. It wasn't just emotional exhaustion, but the feeling that no matter how much we tried, it was never enough. Stephen comforted me, but reaffirmed what he had said before. We can't keep going like this. They have to learn to stand on their own without relying on us to solve all their problems. Emily began insisting that we should hand over the house David was renting. "If you have enough money, buy him a house," she said, not hiding her frustration. Stephen firmly refused to even consider the idea. "Until David learns to fend for himself, we won't do it. If we give in, what will be left for us?" I knew Stephen was right. It was sensible advice, but it still broke my heart. After all, David was our only son, and it was hard to refuse something he directly or indirectly asked for. However, Emily's behavior convinced me that Stephen was right. If we gave in, it would only encourage their dependence. Our relationship quickly deteriorated. Every encounter seemed like a silent battle, a clash of mutual criticisms and resentments. Even Paul, who had once been a source of joy, now began to carry the weight of expectations and tension. I no longer knew how to resolve the situation. All I wanted was peace. Over time, I realized that my relationship with Emily was becoming increasingly strained. As Paul grew, he also became more active and demanding, which was an increasingly big challenge for me. My health was no longer what it used to be, and caring for an energetic child became an extremely exhausting task. One day, while watching him play, Paul started running around the hallway. For a moment, I took my eyes off him, and in that brief moment, he tripped over a toy and fell, hitting his head. His forehead struck a wooden detail, and a deep cut appeared right in the middle. Blood began to flow, and I panicked. My heart nearly stopped as he screamed, his small body trembling in pain. Stephen rushed over when he heard the scream. Without thinking, we picked Paul up and immediately took him to the hospital. At the hospital, the doctors quickly treated the wound and reassured us that he was fine. Though relieved, tears still streamed down my cheeks. I felt guilty, as if I had failed to protect him. When I called David to recount the incident, I tried to reassure him. "The cut has been treated, and he's fine now. Don't worry." I hoped he would understand, but I felt growing anxiety about Emily's reaction. When we returned home, David and Emily arrived shortly after. Paul was asleep, and they immediately went to him. I sensed the tension in the air. When Emily turned to me, her expression was stern, almost like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "How could you let this happen?" she asked, her tone sharp as a knife. "Where did you learn to take care of children?" She looked at me with a mix of contempt and anger, as if I were an incompetent caretaker. It was humiliating. "Listen, children fall. It's normal," I responded calmly, trying to diffuse the situation. "They grow and learn through falls like this." But before I could finish, Emily stepped closer to me with surprising speed and slapped me. The slap was so unexpected that I was stunned. My face burned, and my ears rang for a moment. "You're not even allowed to take your eyes off him," she screamed. "That's the bare minimum expected of a caregiver." I was in shock, unsure how to react. Stephen, who witnessed everything, stood still for a moment before intervening. He stepped closer to Emily and, restraining his anger, slapped her back with equal force. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted. "Don't you ever dare lay a hand on my wife again." It was the first time I saw Stephen so furious. He, who was always calm and rational, was now consumed by anger. "How dare you treat David's mother like this?" he continued, his voice firm and full of contempt. "You've crossed every line." Emily stood there, as if paralyzed, clearly unable to find words. David, meanwhile, seemed torn between his wife and his parents. It was a chaotic and painful moment, and I knew that after that day, nothing would be the same. My husband, Stephen, is the kind of man who rarely raises his voice, let alone resorts to violence. But at that moment, he lost control. He looked directly at David and Emily and said with a resolve he had never shown before, "Get out of here. I don't want to see you again." David, hesitating, tried to comfort me, but I couldn't speak. I was caught in a mix of shame and pain, unable to express what I felt. That night, we did something we rarely did. We bought a bottle of wine and sat around the kitchen table, drinking in silence. There was no need to say anything to share the burden of the situation. The next morning, emotionally exhausted, Stephen said, "Maybe it would have been better if we never had children. It seems we raised David wrong. Maybe it's our fault." He paused for a moment before continuing. "There must be families in worse situations than ours, but I can't help feeling responsible. I worked my whole life as a civil servant, and in the end, I feel I didn't prepare David to face life. I felt guilty too. Perhaps I was wrong to focus so much on work and not pay enough attention to family finances. I thought raising a loving and responsible child was enough, but it seems it wasn't." While we reflected on this, David called me. "Mom, what are you going to do with Paul?" he asked. I felt my patience running out. "David, we've done everything we could for you. Now it's time for you to take responsibility." I hung up and looked at Stephen. We knew we needed to make a firm decision. We packed our things and made it clear that we would no longer allow them to take advantage of us. To live with dignity, we decided to rent out the house David and Emily were living in. We informed them that they needed to move out as soon as possible, as the house would be handed over to someone else. We planned to move to a small coastal town in the south, where no one knew us. It was time for a fresh start, away from the hustle and the hurt. When David learned that the house would be rented to someone else, he panicked. I received a flurry of calls, but I didn't answer any of them. The phone kept ringing, and messages kept coming. Even Emily tried to contact me, but Stephen and I were determined to move forward. After a while, we changed our phone number. We completely cut off contact with them. In the end, we were ready to start a new phase, away from the conflicts that had hurt us. David didn't answer my calls in desperation, and with a hot head, I sent a message saying I would never interfere in his life again. It was something I shouldn't have done, but my emotions got the better of me. The next day, I heard that Emily was pressuring David to distance himself from us even more. The tension had reached a point where he mentioned divorce if she didn't stop blaming our issues for his difficulties. At that moment, Stephen and I decided. We turned off our phones, and a few days later, changed our numbers so no one could find us. We wanted quiet, peace, and a fresh start. We bought an old camper and decided to travel around the south. The plan was simple: live in peace and enjoy the remaining days, away from the family chaos that had consumed us. Despite the freedom, my heart remained heavy. Sometimes I think about David and miss my beloved son. How could it be that the person I carried in my womb and raised with all my love now acts as if I don't exist? The memories are painful, and they only become clearer with time. However, when I hear the birds singing at night, I remember that life goes on, even amidst loss and regret. I know I failed in many things. Perhaps it was my fault for raising David too protectively, not teaching him to face life with strength and independence. My thoughts can't escape the feeling that, somehow, I'm to blame for all of this. Now, in my 60s, I try to rebuild my life in silence. I spent decades dedicating every drop of sweat and energy to my children, never thinking of myself. Only after David and Emily went their own way did I realize I had never spent money or time on myself. In my youth, I lived in the city to ensure David had the best education, but that came at the cost of my happiness and health. In the end, Stephen and I decided it was time to invest in ourselves. With the savings we had left, we bought a small house in a quiet village in Oregon, where I grew up. I always dreamed of returning there, where worries seemed to melt away. Initially, I thought that even if my children wanted to visit, I would always be there. However, village life brought new challenges, especially since medical services were far away. Thinking about the future, I knew that if my health declined, I might only be able to rely on myself, without David or my daughter, Hannah, being regularly present. However, I decided not to let these worries rob me of the peace of mind I had finally found. Moving to the small village of Maplewood, where I bought a wooden house built by a local craftsman, the village still held my childhood memories. I grew up here with my parents before getting married and moving to the big city. When I returned, I worried that people, especially older women, would see me as an outsider, but to my surprise, I was warmly welcomed. It felt like I had never left. The women in the village, some of whom were friends from my youth, tried to draw me into their daily conversations and activities. This helped me adapt to village life and find small jobs that brought in a modest income. Gradually adjusting to the peaceful pace, my children continued their lives. Each found a good partner and got married. Hannah, in particular, seemed full of hope for the future before officially moving to Boston with her husband. She visited me and said, tears streaming down her face, "Mom, I'll live well, and when I have kids, I promise to always visit you." Her words touched my heart. All I could say was, "Sweetheart, just be happy. Don't worry about me." Now, I've been living alone for a while, almost like a nun seeking simplicity and reflection. I don't see Emily and David often, which is probably for the best. But Hannah, even after getting married, calls regularly. "Mom," she begins, her voice full of emotion. I thought marriage would solve all my problems, but the housework never ends, and at work, I can barely keep up with the demands. I don't know how I could have kids in this pace of life. I always listen and comfort, trying to lighten her burden. "Having kids will be even harder," I say. "But you're strong, Hannah. If I did it, you can too." I try to help her understand that despite the difficulties, it's all worth it. But over time, she always ends with a question that catches me off guard. "Mom, why did you have 2 kids if it was so hard?" After a moment of thought, I answer honestly, "Your brother was the firstborn. I always thought that as the eldest, he needed more attention and care. But that doesn't mean I suffered. I was young and inexperienced, and I made many mistakes." My response seems to reassure her, but deep down, I know these conversations are a constant reminder of the decisions that shaped my life. Still, I've learned to accept that not everything is perfect, and that my intentions, though flawed, came from love. I've learned to love with patience and dedication. Everything was difficult, but I endured because I believed love overcomes hardship. When I explain this to Hannah, she responds with a gentle smile. However, I realize that even as an adult and married, she still needs care and attention, as if she was still the spoiled little girl. After getting married, Hannah and her husband visit me once a month. They live about 2 hours away by car, and I know moving from the city to the village, where even a decent cafe is rare, must be challenging. However, the love Hannah feels for her new family is evident. She always tries to include me in her life. One day, while I was tending to my vegetable garden, Hannah arrived unexpectedly with a small box. "Mom," she said, her eyes sparkling with emotion, "I got this for you on my trip." She looked so excited and happy that my heart swelled with joy. I opened the box with a smile, curious about what she had brought. Inside was a photo. Seeing it, I immediately understood what was happening. It was an ultrasound image. Anxiously, I asked, "Are you really going to be a mother?" Hannah nodded, smiling as tears filled her eyes. "Yes, Mom, I'm going to be a mother. I'm 8 weeks pregnant." My happiness was indescribable. I hugged her tightly and started talking non-stop, offering advice and expressing my excitement. "This is just the beginning of caregiving," I said, "when you need help." Looking at the ultrasound, I felt an immediate connection to that tiny life. "This little one is truly mine," I thought as tears rolled down my cheeks. Hannah laughed through her tears and asked, "Mom, when will my belly start growing? I haven't even told my colleagues." Her excitement was contagious. After that visit, I began looking forward to the birth of my grandchild. It didn't matter if it was a boy or a girl. I was eager for this new phase in our family. Over time, friends and neighbors started asking me about my preferences. "Would you prefer a grandson or a granddaughter?" Some said granddaughters are more sensitive and closer to their grandmothers, while others thought a grandson would carry on the family line. I simply replied that any child would be a blessing. While eagerly awaiting the birth, I thought about David and Emily. They had made a different decision. When they got married, they came to me and said bluntly, "Mom, we've decided not to have kids. We want to live our lives, just the two of us." At the time, I was surprised but respected their choice. After all, they were the ones to decide what was best for them. Now, with Hannah's pregnancy, it seemed things were coming back into balance. I couldn't wait to meet the little life that had brought so much joy to our lives. Since David and Emily decided not to have children, I tried not to interfere with their choice. However, village life rekindled my curiosity and longing for the children around me. When Hannah announced her pregnancy, my anticipation grew. Time passed quickly, and soon the due date arrived. Before that, my son-in-law, John, called me. He got straight to the point. "Mother-in-law, can you help us after the baby is born? We're really counting on you." Though I knew it would be a big commitment, I didn't have the heart to say no. "Are you sure?" I asked, already imagining how it would change my routine. He replied, "Yes, please. Just 1 or 2 months. We'll give you some pocket money so you don't have to worry about anything." I was surprised by the offer of pocket money. I responded firmly, "I'm Hannah's mother. There's no reason to pay me for helping my daughter. Keep that money for the baby's needs, as it will need a lot in the future." However, reflecting later, I wondered if I should have agreed. If I had thought more carefully about the financial and emotional costs this entailed, perhaps I would have acted differently, but it was too late for regrets. Hannah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. I knew John secretly hoped for a boy, but his eyes lit up with pride and joy. As they say nowadays, it was as if honey flowed from his eyes. I was moved to see his love for his daughter. However, Hannah didn't seem as thrilled as I expected. The birth was difficult for her. Her body was still in pain and exhausted. I spent the first 2 months helping as much as I could, But Hannah became increasingly irritable and impatient. When the baby cried, she easily lost control, raising her voice and sometimes even refusing to try soothing her. One day is etched in my memory. The baby was crying incessantly, and in desperation, Hannah grabbed the baby bottle and shouted, "I'm not breastfeeding anymore." I tried to calm her, saying, "Hannah, calm down. You're tired, but this will pass." She responded angrily, "Then how am I supposed to go back to work in 4 months? What am I going to do? Nowadays, formula is good enough. I can't do this on my own." Her voice was full of desperation, and I knew her words reflected the exhaustion and pressure she felt. Though I tried to comfort and support her, I could clearly see Hannah struggling. I felt overwhelmed myself, but I kept helping, believing it was only temporary. Even I, who was always patient, began to wonder why I was taking on so much responsibility. The original plan was to help Hannah for 2 months, but somehow it stretched into half a year. During that time, I noticed Hannah gradually regaining her emotional stability. She seemed calmer and more confident. I remember saying to her, "Hannah, not every mother finds their child beautiful right away. Sometimes it takes time for that love to grow." I tried to reassure her, saying that in time she would see the beauty and special bond with her daughter. A few months later, I finally saw Hannah gently holding her daughter. She started noticing small details: the eyes that seemed full of life, the nose that resembled John's. Seeing this bond form was a relief for me. I could finally breathe after months of tension. However, when the time to return to work approached, anxiety enveloped Hannah again. "Mom," she said, tears streaming down her face, "what will I do if you're not here?" I knew she was worried about managing work, housework, and the baby on her own. It was clear she still depended on me heavily. I reassured her, but deep down, I felt the growing burden of responsibility. John, my son-in-law, also began showing signs of exhaustion. He worked long hours and often came home late, drained. As a result, much of the responsibility for caring for the baby fell on me. After months of continuous support, I decided it was time to return to my home in the village. When I told Hannah this, she became furious. Her entire body seemed to radiate anger, and her words were sharp, full of resentment. "You're abandoning us now?" she said, almost chasing me out of the house. Even after I returned to the village, the demands didn't stop. Hannah kept calling me for help in emergencies, when her daughter had a fever or when John was away on business. I would get in the car and drive to the city to help them. More than once, I rushed from home to pick up my granddaughter from daycare, waiting while they both finished overtime work. These frequent trips became part of my life, and though I wanted to help, I couldn't escape the feeling that my time and peace were constantly being sacrificed. However, I continued helping because deep down, I didn't know how to say no to my daughter. Years passed, and I thought things would get better as my granddaughter, Julia, grew up. But instead, Hannah's sensitivity only worsened. Her complaints became constant. "Why are you always at daycare when my friends come? Why do you pick up Julia so late?" These were frustrating questions, and I tried to offer advice. "One of you needs to cut back on work hours or hire a babysitter to help." But my advice was never taken. Until Julia was 5 years old, my routine was traveling between my village home and Hannah's house in Boston at least 3 times a week. I was exhausted. Despite doing my best, they only paid me about $20,000 a month, which barely covered gas expenses. Yet, I still cared for Julia, as if I were the only solution. One day, Hannah called me over to talk. Her face, until she started elementary school, I felt like I'd been hit over the head. They wanted me to fully take on raising Julia. Worse, since I lived in the village and couldn't keep traveling, they suggested bringing Julia to live with me. The idea shocked me. I couldn't believe parents would give up their child like that. I refused them, saying, "Please don't ask me to do this." However, Hannah didn't give up. She knelt beside me, took my hand, and tried to convince me. "Mom, please, just for a while. We don't know what else to do." Her attempt to seem sweet and pleading only heightened my anxiety. Then John knelt too, his eyes full of desperation. "We're at our limit. We can't do this on our own. Please help us." Seeing them both kneeling like that tore me apart. On one hand, I felt angry and frustrated. Why couldn't Hannah and John take responsibility as parents? On the other hand, I felt sorry for them because of their immense sacrifice. I was angry with Hannah for placing so much burden on me, but I knew that somehow I had contributed to this by not setting clear boundaries from the start. I took a deep breath and, with a heavy heart, realized that my decision would affect us all. Hannah and John's eyes widened in surprise when I mentioned money. "Money?" Hannah asked, her voice full of disbelief. A rush of heat surged through my head. For years I had done everything I could out of love for my grandchild and compassion for my daughter. I never asked for anything in return. But at that moment, I realized how much they had grown accustomed to taking advantage of me. Hannah continued, "You know we're on a tight budget. After paying the mortgage interest, there's hardly anything left." She paused, but before I could respond, she added, "Mom, you have savings. One day, when you're old, it'll be our responsibility to take care of you, right? So why is it like this now?" Her words were a mix of half-hearted threat and emotional manipulation. Suddenly, I felt a deep sadness and regret. Everything I had done for her, all the support, seemed distorted. Seeing my expression, Hannah said, "Mom, why are you making this?" My patience finally ran out. I stood up, silently, with a heavy heart, and gently took her hand. Hannah looked confused, staring at me with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. But I knew I couldn't continue in this cycle. I grabbed my bag and went straight back to my village home, determined to reclaim my peace. When I got there, I deleted Hannah and John's phone numbers. Any messages that might come to my phone were something I no longer had the strength to read. I decided to change my phone number. I needed time and distance to recover from everything that had happened. During that time, I stayed with a childhood friend who lived alone in a nearby village. I stayed there for a few weeks, away from the demands and emotional pressure Hannah and John had placed on me. Deep down, I wondered if they would try to find me, but surprisingly, they were silent. They didn't call, didn't try to locate me, and didn't ask for help from other relatives. On one hand, I felt relieved, as if I could finally breathe, free from all the pain and entanglement. But at the same time, my heart was broken. Had I become so estranged? In that moment, I realized that my story was both a reminder and a lesson. It shows how complex family relationships are and how love, when not balanced by healthy boundaries, can turn into an emotional trap. They say parents have a responsibility to raise their children and help them build a stable life. But it seems nowadays that doesn't end when children get married. We live in an era where grandparents often take on raising their grandchildren while parents work to provide for the family. More and more grandparents around the age of 60 return to the role of primary caregivers, as if they're experiencing motherhood again. Parents, especially mothers, have a strong desire to provide a better life for their children, even at the cost of their own dreams and comfort. That's one of the pillars of parental love. We, as parents, do this hoping our efforts will reflect in our children's happiness and success. It's a universal instinct, a mission we carry within us. In our culture, parents often have a special love for their children. If something concerns their children's happiness, they spare no effort, even if they themselves live in difficult and deprived conditions. They believe any sacrifice is worthwhile if it can pave an easier path for their children. However, in this process, many parents lose themselves. By giving everything to their children, parents may unintentionally foster dependence, hindering their children's emotional growth and independence. Children raised under excessive parental protection, never learning to face difficulties on their own, often fail to develop genuine respect or gratitude. They assume their parents will always be there to support them, no matter the circumstances. Therefore, it's crucial to treat children as independent individuals, recognizing that they need to build their own lives and face their own battles. This is an act of love, even if it feels difficult at first. Although the parent-child relationship is special and often seen as something predestined, we must remember it's just one of many relationships in life. Like any other human relationship, it's essential to apply respect and common sense. Parents who sacrifice everything for their children risk losing themselves in the process. They neglect their own lives, dreams, and futures to care for their children's futures. However, everyone deserves to live a full and balanced life. Parents need to learn to find a balance between supporting their children and nurturing themselves. Ultimately, true love isn't about control or endless sacrifice, but about freedom, respect, and trust. This reflection applies not only to parents and children, but to finding harmony in all human relationships. It's a lesson in how to love without losing yourself. Children, no matter how important, shouldn't be the absolute center of our lives. Constantly thinking about them, worrying about every detail, and expending energy to solve problems that aren't always ours is a tremendous waste of time and energy. Looking back, I realize I could have lived a fuller life if I had learned to balance my role as a mother with caring for myself. Children aren't perfect reflections of their parents' lives, nor are they a measure of our existence's success. Old age for parents isn't a reward, and raising children is often a mixed experience. Sometimes it brings joy, but sometimes it becomes an emotional and physical burden. This is bitter and difficult, but looking back, you realize that every moment, good or bad, leaves a mark, turning your life into a quilt stitched with pieces of memory. And somehow, this teaches us to be grateful. The secret to finding peace in this process is simple. Envision what you truly want to say and do, then act on it with clear boundaries and balanced love. This is the key to raising children who lead healthy, fulfilling lives. Unfortunately, many of us, especially in the generation of mothers, grew up believing that unconditional sacrifice for children and husbands is a virtue, that giving up our desires and happiness is the price of a good family. But now, I see that's not true. Above all, you need to put yourself first.